Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The geopolitical world is a little uncertain right now. But amid all of that turmoil, all the polarization, all the threats and political enemies and the consequences of massive electoral swings, one thing has been certain in this country for decades. Canada is a united country, despite all those political differences. You'd have to go back almost 30 years to find the last time our actual national cohesion was challenged. And since that 1995 Quebec referendum, for all the talk of Wexit or Western independence, almost everyone in the country would consider the matter settled when Quebec voted to remain a part of Canada. But history repeats, and if you look at the political conditions that led to the narrow vote that almost split the country, well, there are some striking similarities with today. So is the past prologue for Quebec secession? The next couple of years might show us more about a new sovereigntist movement than most of us might care to see. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Gerald Butts is the vice chair of the Eurasia Group, as well as the director of the World Wildlife Fund, but when talking politics, you may know him as the former principal secretary both to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and former Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty. Hey, Gerald.
Hello, it's good to be here.
It is great to have you here, and this is a fascinating topic. And as I was thinking of talking to you about it, I realized, first of all, how old I am, and second of all, how many people listening probably have no concept of the threat of Quebec secession in real time. So maybe if you could, just like a brief history of Quebec Sovereignty 101, if possible.
Well, it's tough to be brief on that one. I can tell you as a young and slightly terrified graduate student at McGill University, I remember vividly the last one, which was, of course, in 1995, and proceeded after a PQ government was elected following a long-in-the-tooth Liberal government of Robert Bourassa and then Daniel Johnson, succeeded by Jacques Parizeau. And coincidentally, the Bloc Québécois, which had just been formed under the leadership of Lucien Bouchard, became the official opposition after the 1993 federal election. And I remember very vividly living in Montreal when they were elected in 1994, and everybody was saying, don't worry, there's a 20-point lead for the no side in any potential secession vote. So even if they do hold true to their promise to have a referendum in their first mandate, the PQ is obviously going to lose it. And then 9 months later, we were all hanging on by our fingernails as the country stuck together by less than a point.
You know what? As you describe that, I got a vivid memory as well, because as listeners to the show will know, my family grew up half the time in Toronto and half the time on a farm in the eastern townships in Quebec. And I remember that night watching with my parents, who were incredibly nervous because this was like their life potentially about to be divided up.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Canadians felt that way. And I think a lot of Canadians, both inside and outside of Quebec, felt that way. It was quite a shock that the campaign was that close. And it was almost like a U.S. presidential election. It was several thousand votes away from going in the other direction. And I alluded to this in my piece, but Jean Lapierre and Chantal Hébert wrote a terrific book that was published in 2015. I think it was called The Morning After, or The Day After, where they recollect in vivid detail how there was no plan in either Quebec City or Ottawa, really, to deal with the yes vote.
And that was, now 30 years ago almost. And in your piece in the Walrus, you kind of bring up a much more recent example, though not as local. Can you explain a little bit why Brexit is such a looming shadow right now in what you see as the future of Quebec sovereignty or secession?
Yeah, I think it's an important analogy. It's not perfect like all analogies. It's instructive, but it's not a perfect one-for-one fit.
Right.
I do, though, recall vividly the run-up to the Brexit referendum where you had a government in the UK that had been elected on a slogan that was roughly the same as the one that the opposition is running on here in Canada. He accused the long-standing Labour Party government at that time of Gordon Brown of creating a broken Britain. And immigration was one of the key proof points of that argument. And I think the danger I want to point out, and it's not a partisan point, I think it could be applied to just about every political party. The danger I was trying to point out in the Walrus piece is that it's one thing to criticize a government and its policies. It's another thing to imply that a country itself is broken. And that invites all kinds of actors that mean the country harm to get involved in the politics of whatever country you're talking about, in these two cases, the United Kingdom and Canada. And I think that's a very dangerous table to set because as Canadians, if you want to be charitable about it, we see the best in other countries and the best in other people. And if you want to be uncharitable, you would say that a lot of Canadians are naive about the world. And in particular, the world we live in 2024 is a very different one, even from the world of 2015, let alone 1995. There are a lot of very aggressive actors out there that mean this country harm. And we should be very careful within our internal domestic politics about making claims that the country itself is broken rather than the government or the policies it's promoting.
You've touched on a couple of things there that factor into what you sort of paint, at least to me, as a perfect storm for Quebec sovereigntists. Can you give us a sense of what are the factors that are coming together to create those conditions before we talk about them individually and break them down?
Sure. Well, there are three in particular. The first one I just sort of alluded to, and that is what I see as an excessive negativity about the country in both the political class and the commentariat. I think that it would be easy to forget that this country is consistently ranked at the top of every list of things that humans could reasonably be expected to provide for one another, whether that be economic opportunity or social justice. The country is not perfect, but if you were to ask me to choose another country to live in, I would have a hard time doing it. So it's important, I think, for everybody to realize that. And I think most regular Canadians do realize this, that they're proud of their country and they're positive about their country and they love their country. But if you were to only listen to the political class and the commentariat, you would think that this country was a smoking ruin. So I think that it's important for us to kind of put that in its place. There's this great line from Shakespeare that these violent delights have violent ends, and I worry we're headed down that path as they did in Britain. So the negativity is the first thing. The second thing is a radically changed geopolitical environment where, in particular, the Russians and the Chinese, but also, as we've seen latterly, the Indian government under Narendra Modi has had no reservation about interfering in domestic politics of other countries where they think their national interests are at stake. And the Russians in particular, as has been well documented in the UK, in France, in Great Britain, and especially in the United States, have been, to use the Canadian analogy, they're not in the press box, they're on the ice in our domestic politics. So the foreign interference angle, I think, is a really important one as well.
We've recently talked on this show about the disconnect between, the overall numbers of where Canada is in the world, and even, the more recent economic numbers, and then the emotional reaction Canadians have, especially to high prices on everyday items or the price of a modern duplex home in Toronto or another large city, and how that creates the conditions for a changing government no matter what the economic indicators say. But I guess my question to you then is, if that is part of the conditions for this, wouldn't that theoretically change, assuming that the government changes, as most people in the polls expect it will, with the next election?
Well, I think it could. And the points you make leading into that are really important ones, that people don't live their lives comparing it constantly to people in other countries. They live it comparing their lives to what they have previously experienced.
Right.
And for most people, especially people under, call it the age of 50, have never really experienced an acute inflationary environment, right? So watching prices go from where they were in 2019 to where they are today was an extremely stressful situation, very difficult for regular people to deal with. And you can quote to them economic statistics till you're blue in the face. It's not going to change the anxiety that situation causes. At Eurasia Group, at the beginning of the inflationary spike, we did a study of what happens to incumbent governments when they're enduring an inflationary period. And sounds a bit wonky, but I think your listeners will get the drift. We discovered that if you're an incumbent, you're 2 degrees of standard variation more likely to lose the next election if you endure an inflationary period. And that is true no matter what your ideological predisposition is or what your popularity level was going into that period. And by the way, that's borne itself out. Whether you're a social democratic government in Finland, a conservative government in the United Kingdom, governments in Colombia and Chile, all over the world have either lost outright, or in the case of even the Modi government, underperformed their expectations dramatically. And this is true, as I say, no matter what, whether you're a right-wing government, a left-wing government, or a centrist government, you're not going to escape the scars of inflation. To answer your question directly, I guess it could change if there's a change in government. What I worry about with the particular constellation that seems to be shaping up is you could end up with a strong Bloc Québécois under Yves-François Blanchet, and you could end up with a Poilievre government where the only thing that those two men seem to agree about is that Canada is broken.
How would that play in Quebec in terms of Poilievre becoming prime minister and the reaction that Quebecers have had to him, at least so far during his time as Conservative leader?
Well, there's a lot of hockey left to play, to torture the analogy a little bit between now and whenever the election happens. And Mr. Poilievre has a chance to improve his standing. But if the election were today, you would end up with a massive Conservative government with very little representation inside Quebec. And I think the dynamic that's taking place, and this can be disrupted, of course, the dynamic that started, though, is that Quebecers, they seem to have decided that Anglophones are going to make Pierre Poilievre prime minister, and they're going to vote to protect themselves by electing a large number of Bloc Québécois MPs. And that, not coincidentally, is exactly the scenario that, not quite exactly the scenario that transpired in 1993, because we had a Francophone Quebecer prime minister at the time. But you did have the Bloc Québécois won enough seats to become, in fact, the official opposition in that parliament. So if the polls continue the way they're going, and they often don't, as I've certainly experienced in my previous life in politics, they do not, you would see a situation where you'd have the Conservatives with most of their strength outside of Quebec and a strong Bloc Québécois opposition within Quebec. And that, I think, is a recipe for a referendum that'll be hard to fight.
And if we do come across that dynamic, what role could the foreign interference that you mentioned play? And honestly, why would foreign powers want to interfere in that kind of what would seem to be, an internal squabble in Canada?
That's a good question. And I think, again, Canadians, we tend to be a little modest about our place in the world. We do have a seat around the G7 table. And more importantly, we have an almost 10,000 kilometer border with the United States. And if I were looking to cause chaos, I say cause chaos. It seems like the United States is doing a good job of that themselves these days.
Right.
If I were looking to add to the chaos that the United States is experiencing, disrupting or contributing to the dissolution of their most significant trading partner and a neighbor that, again, they share a 10,000 kilometer border with, would be a good recipe for that. So it wouldn't really be about us, although I suspect the Russians would love to take down a G7 country as a head to put on the wall. They'd be more interested in further disrupting the United States.
What form could that take in terms of what would, again, be, a very inward-looking debate, I guess, in Quebec over yes or no?
Well, I think it could take a bunch of forms. The way, in particular, Russian interference works, and I said this in the piece, and I don't want anybody to think that I believe Quebecers or other Canadians are naive enough to be duped into voting for something they don't want by devious Russian spies. This is not a Jean Le Carré novel, right? But what the FSB is in particular adept at is finding pre-existing divisions within their adversarial states and exploiting those divisions principally online by creating inflammatory confrontations between a pro-immigration and an anti-immigration faction within the UK, for instance. In Canada, I speculate in the piece that could find a platform on the divided view on climate change between the fossil fuel producing provinces and those that don't produce fossil fuels, in particular, Quebec in this case.
Why is climate change such a leverage point for Quebec in particular that it could be exploited in that way?
Well, it's really simple. I think that, as I say in the piece, like many well-meaning countries that produce fossil fuels, we've had a hard time getting our act together on climate change in Canada. And full disclosure, of course, I've been a part of that in trying to help have a progressive policy on climate change for most of my career in Canada. But it's true in Canada, it's true in the United States, it's true in every country that produces fossil fuels, save and except Norway. Climate change is a very divisive issue because the regions of those countries where fossil fuels are produced, people who live there identify climate change as a threat to their livings, their jobs. And often the people who want a more progressive approach to climate change don't, I guess, adequately accommodate that view. And that creates a divisive issue that would be very fertile ground for malevolent actors that don't really care about one side of the debate or the other. They just look for conflict, and wherever they find a divide, they try and widen that divide and create animosity on both sides of it.
Maybe again, for those who don't have the history and experience with the previous referendum, if you could kind of sketch out what has to happen next for the kind of conditions to be met to send us down this road.
Well, most importantly, the PQ has to win the provincial election in Quebec. And the added dimension to the foreign interference is that the way referenda are conducted in this country at the provincial level, especially Quebec, the federal government has no formal role, right? There's a yes committee and a no committee. And to a certain degree, even federal interference in a Quebec referendum is determined to be foreign interference by the government of Quebec. And there is, as far as I know, no apparatus within Quebec to determine whether truly foreign actors are trying to influence the outcome of their politics. So imagine, if you will, a scenario where CSIS becomes aware of a massive Russian disinformation or misinformation campaign taking place online simultaneously in Quebec and in Alberta and Saskatchewan, trying to create fights between Canadians in the middle of a referendum campaign. I guess my question is, would that be taken seriously by the PQ government of Quebec at the time, or would it be held up as an example of the federal government trying to influence the outcome of the referendum on the no side? This is, to me, the single biggest difference between the geopolitical environment of 1995, not to mention the communications environment of 1995 and their analogs today, that we didn't have to worry about Twitter wars spiraling into the fleur-de-lis being burned in Calgary and a giant fight breaking out between Alberta and Quebec in the middle of a referendum campaign in 1995.
When you write this piece and think about the potential here for the kind of campaign that would fracture the country, is there anything we could be doing now to preempt that? I think over the past year plus, we've certainly taken foreign interference more seriously, but is there anywhere that we should be looking to focus our attention in advance of these dynamics accelerating?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I think the broad point to be made on this is the way I conclude the piece, which is that ultimately your defense against this is the common public square, right? It's the kindness and the shared values that regular people have in all parts of the country. And I know that sounds a little esoteric, but I think it's actually really important that we not be too cynical about the way regular Canadians inside and outside of Quebec see their country. I think, unlike the political class too often sounds, or the commentariat too often sounds, people love their country and they think it's a great place to live. And whether they disagree with their government or not, they don't want to see anything irreparably damage the country. So I think fostering that goodwill between Canadians is the most important thing that we can do. But there are also really practical things, and the list of those is long. But I think most importantly, and we're, as you allude, we're headed down that track, is just to become a lot more aware of how foreign interference works, and that it's a factor in Canadian politics, that it's not going away anytime soon. And we should look at other countries and how they have examined this problem and developed solutions for it. There was, after all, massive investigations in most of our sister democracies after democratic events, if I can put it that way, referenda in the case of the UK, or elections in the case of France, the United States, and Germany, where they looked pretty closely at the way foreign malevolent actors interfered in their campaigns, and they shored up their systems to try and make it harder to do so. I think France has been a leading light in this regard.
Gerald, thank you for walking us through this. Obviously, we all hope it doesn't come to pass, but it's certainly a good thing to consider in advance.
Yeah, well, forewarned is forearmed, right? And I thought a lot about whether I should write this piece and how people would interpret it, those readers who are familiar with my background. But at the end of the day, I think I've been lucky to have some positions in my career that gave me some unique insights and information to this kind of thing. And I would be kicking myself if the situation I'm worried about came to pass and I didn't say anything about it beforehand.
I'm glad you said it with us as well as in the Walrus. Thanks again.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for the time.
Gerald Butts of the Eurasia Group and the director of the World Wildlife Fund. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can always head to thebigstorypodcast.ca, and while you're there, you can hit the Contact Us button to let us know what you think. I imagine this episode and this guest might lead to a few emails. I would love to read them. I'd love to hear what you think about this idea that I had not considered. You can also just shoot us an email anytime at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can call us up and talk it out by leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in all your podcast players. It's on the website I mentioned. It's in your smart speaker. Just ask that smart speaker to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.